The record will reflect that parties and counsel, as well as members of the jury, have returned to the courtroom after a morning recess. We are ready to hear cross-examination by the state of Dr. Michael Spence. You may proceed, Mr. Maybanks.
Thank you. And good morning again, Dr. Spence.
Good morning.
So there's a store here that sells T-shirts that are kind of Iowa-based, and one of the T-shirts says University of Iowa, Idaho City, Ohio. Is that kind of how you feel being here?
Yes, sometimes.
Maybe you should pick that one up. So I want to talk to you about a few things. First thing is you testified here this morning about secondary transfer of DNA. Is that a fair kind of topic?
In part, yes.
Yeah, okay. And sometimes that's referred to as tertiary transfer, isn't it?
Well, that would be the next step. That's primary, secondary, and tertiary.
Gotcha. And just to be clear here for the record, and I think we kind of covered this already, but you have not gathered in your investigation any specific facts or any knowledge from the case file or from the proceedings that show that a secondary transfer occurred from Jerry Burns' DNA to Michelle Martinko's dress, correct?
No, I have not.
Okay. And so you're not testifying in this case that it's your opinion that the way Jerry Burns' DNA got on her dress was through a secondary transfer?
No, I'm not testifying to that.
Okay. So, Dr. Spence, you've testified in a lot of cases around the country, right?
A fair number, yes.
And do you remember a case that you testified in, it would be U.S. v. Dieter, D-I-E-T-E-R. Does that sound familiar to you?
Yes, I do.
Okay. All right. That was fairly recent. That was a decision, well, it was a case from probably 2016 or so. Underlying facts were from 2009. The United States District Court for District of New Mexico filed an opinion upholding a conviction in that case in 2017. You familiar with all that?
Yeah, it seems like my role in that was much earlier.
Okay. Yeah, you've appeared in that case and did a PowerPoint presentation explaining secondary transfer of DNA. Remember that?
I don't recall if I did that, but if you're saying so, I believe so. I think that would be a case that involved possible transfer events.
And do you remember saying in that case, or maybe this is something you say in a lot of cases where you testify about this, that in that case the transfer event of DNA was within the realm of possibilities? Remember using that language?
I probably did say that, yes.
Okay. And so I guess my question to you, Dr. Spence, is what exactly is not within the realm of possibilities?
That's a really difficult question to answer.
Right.
It's really hard to nail that down.
Mm-hmm.
You can't. I could not sit here and say it's within the realm of possibilities that I don't exist. I mean, I took philosophy class in college, so they teach you that how do you really know that this isn't all just a dream, and your actual dream world is the real world. So you can't even say that. So there's a lot of things that are plausible. Some things are very implausible, and it's hard to put a percentage on them.
Okay. I didn't know you were going to wax so philosophical. That's good.
You did that to me.
But that's the point, though. I mean, when you talk about the realm of possibilities, anything's possible, right?
A lot of things are. Some things are extremely improbable, but they're within the realm of possibilities.
Okay. With regard to the studies that you reviewed in the area of secondary transfer, first of all, none of those studies, you didn't do any of those studies, right?
No, I did not.
Okay. You just reviewed those in preparation for your testimony here today and other cases you've testified in?
Yes, when I talk about the 298 articles on DNA transfer that are in the recent review, right. I'm sure I haven't read all of those.
And to the extent that you can recall those, don't the vast majority of those studies involve the scientists involved in creating purposeful transfers and then measuring them?
I'd say there's more of those than there are studies on possible transfer events that occur in casework, because in the casework, you never can really be sure of the mechanisms. You really are speculating in those instances. So a lot of it is creative research on the plausibility of various circumstances.
So in some cases, scientists in a lab perform these staged handshakes where they handshake for maybe an extended period of time and then test the transfer of something from one to another and then report their findings. Is that a fair, I guess, description of at least some of those studies?
Some of those, yes.
Okay. Are you familiar with the study from the Journal of Forensic Science? This would be a 1999 study called A Systematic Analysis of Secondary DNA Transfer. The researcher was Ladd, L-A-D-D.
I have seen a paper with Ladd being the lead author, yes.
Okay, and in that paper, they were looking over previous statements or a previous study by other scientists, and they were recovering DNA from, this previous study, they were recovering DNA from palm swabbings, from frequently handled objects such as phones, door handles, and keyboards, and from objects handled under controlled conditions. Does that ring a bell?
I don't recall exactly what the conditions were of that particular study, but that sounds plausible.
And in that study, isn't it true, or maybe if you recall, that when they conducted the analysis, most significantly, in no instance was the profile of the second individual detected?
That may be the case. We have to take that into context. That was 1999. The sensitivity of the technology was gradually improving over the next several years, and it's much more sensitive here in 2020. It was significantly more sensitive in 2005, and it's one study, and I've seen many studies in there where the yield of DNA is remarkably low.
In 1999, they weren't necessarily able to develop as comprehensive or extensive a profile, but they could detect the presence of DNA.
In some instances, yes.
Right. And with regard to the transfer of DNA, wouldn't you agree that when assessing the probability of detecting DNA of interest within a scenario that incorporates multiple contact events, where that transfer may have occurred, one first needs to determine the order of contact of events within the pathway of interest, and then to consider the impact of the variables present at each event. Sound familiar?
That makes sense. And is this, we're still talking about the Ladd paper, or is this a different one?
No, this is not the Ladd paper. I think this is one that is far more recent and may have provided the foundation for some of your testimony today from Forensic Science International, DNA Transfer and Forensic Science, a review.
That's the 2019 article,
Correct.
I believe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that statement then that's contained on page 155 of that article, doesn't that pretty well indicate that you need to know the preceding events in order to properly study whether the transfer events took place?
I think that's what they're trying to say. I think that more accurately, that's the goal. Sometimes it's very difficult to say what the sequence of events are. As I mentioned, when we do typing, we are taking a snapshot of what's there at the time. And you can't really tell the history of what might have led up to getting that snapshot. And I think the authors who wrote that know that. Right. But what they're saying, if there are ways to try to re-piece together through other evidence the sequence of events, that can be really helpful.
And to reach scientifically valid findings, or at least to be able to profess things scientifically, you need to be able to report that you can trace these events and that you made these findings. Otherwise, aren't you just in the realm of possibilities?
Yes.
Okay. And there's also a lot of factors involved in DNA secondary transfer, isn't there?
Absolutely.
And as this paper shows from 2018 from the Forensic Science International Journal, some of those factors would involve, for example, when there's a transfer of dried blood from a porous cotton substrate to another cotton substrate, or to a non-porous flat plastic substrate when pressure with friction was applied. That's a variable, right?
Yeah, those were a few variables you mentioned there. One is what the source is. They were mentioning dried blood, and they're talking about friction is definitely going to be pertinent to transfer events.
And in that particular circumstance, according to the study cited by Goray, G-O-R-A-Y, Goray found that there was a transfer in less than 1% of those circumstances. Is that right?
In that particular instance, that may have been the instance, yes.
And so then there's a lot of other factors that are required for this transfer as well. For example, I think the same study showed that there was far less transfer in those circumstances, from 0 to 3.4%, when there was no friction applied between the substrates. Does that sound right?
Yeah, and that's getting back to friction's going to be important, duration of the time of the transfer event, whatever they're testing there. And this is in an artificial environment, again, where they're testing to see what happens when they use this amount of friction or an increased amount of friction, and duration is going to be important as well.
In that same study, Gorey also found less DNA appeared to be transferred when touch deposits were left for 24 hours prior to transfer than when the material was freshly deposited. Sound right?
Over time, you can definitely see you're not going to get more DNA from it just sitting there. So there's going to be more opportunities for the DNA to get eroded off of an item or for it to even decay. That's typically going to be when it's much more time.
There's a lot of studies that they summarize in here. Another one is Buckingham, who found that in transfer experiments that were done there, again, controlled experiments, that DNA picked up by a hand from a previously touched knife handle that subsequently contacted a glass plate or cotton plate was far less retrievable from the cotton than from the glass.
Yeah, the type,
right?
I think you're talking about the type of surface now. That's going to have an impact, whether you're talking about a smooth surface like glass, and this is going to be similar, or if you're talking about a fabric, the transfer rates are going to be different.
These are all things that you need to know to be able to make findings regarding whether transfer DNA occurred.
Yeah, you might
A
have
lot of
said.
factors, right?
Yeah, you might have said the word determine, and you're not really going to be able to determine the exact facts, but to shed some light on what you can expect from possible transfer events, friction, duration, the type of surface, whether it's a
Surface.
fabric.
Yep, surface is huge, chemical compositions, fiber type, weave thickness, even the electrical charge will have an impact on a transfer, right?
I suppose so. I don't believe I've seen that paper.
Oh, that's, well, that's the paper that you referenced, you want to see it, or?
Is that, well, if it's in the review article,
Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot of papers in there, and as I said, I probably read pretty close to half of those, but maybe close to two-thirds of them, but in passing, and some others I've studied it in detail. But Buckingham, you mentioned, that name doesn't strike a bell. It may be a paper I haven't looked at.
Well, maybe you can read that in the plane on the way back.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And then obviously the event that causes the transfer is huge, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so for instance, in this paper, they talk about biological materials such as blood, saliva, and semen are often transferred during altercations, whether while fresh or at some time after it is dried.
And
So that's a real strong indication of a transfer there, an altercation, right?
Yes, and that's intuitive. If
Yeah.
you have an altercation, there's going to be a higher likelihood of a transfer, and if you got body fluids involved, there's going to be a higher rate of transfer.
Right, and so you kind of read my next thought here, but wet, liquid, biological sources have significantly higher transfer rates than when they're dry, right?
Yeah, and on top of that, you have to recognize that body fluids have typically a lot more DNA involved. So, and the transfer rate in a liquid form are going to be transferred much more readily than dry transfer.
There's a large difference in the quantity of DNA transfer too between wet and dry substances, isn't there?
And that's really what I'm talking about, is that the higher amount of cellular material in the liquids, if we're talking about liquids, not just water that's has no DNA in it, if there's just water involved, talking about actual liquids that are from body fluids, there are going to be more cells, more DNA in there, and just because it's liquid, it transfers more readily.
In fact, the Warshauer, Warshauer et al., found that there's a pretty distinct difference here, that the transfer between wet and dry substances is 44 to 100% versus less than 1%, respectively. Right?
Yeah, it is a higher rate of transfer with body fluids and liquids, yes.
And it's important also to be aware of how quickly the material dries and the duration between the initial disposition and contact with another surface. So the timing of how long something's been there, that's pretty huge too, right?
The timing, the duration of the transfer, the humidity is going to affect it.
This previous study by Van Oorschot, Oorschot, showed that blood on a hard, non-porous substrate will dry within 30 to 60 minutes and sometimes quicker in warmer temperatures. Sound right?
It makes sense to me, and that is the most prolific author And he's the lead author on the review.
Oh, good, we landed on him.
So he's citing his own work there.
Excellent. He also said, this foremost person on the subject, that the transfer rates of blood 5 minutes after deposition declines exponentially until the deposit is dry. That's, I mean, he's the guy, right? So
If he
that's-
says so, yeah, I would trust in that depending on a lot of other factors, absolutely.
Going back to Gore again here. This is again in the same paper. DNA deposits by hand transfer at a different rate to blood and saliva. Such DNA deposits transfer at significantly lower rates than blood and saliva. Is that right?
Yeah, that's intuitive, and that's what I would agree with 100%.
Looks like the authors also talk about individuals who may be shedders. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a poorly defined concept, but it is known that some people do just give off more DNA, and this is where I was talking about the 2 million cells per minute from the average person, and it does vary quite a bit from one person to another. This has been seen in laboratories where some people have a real difficult time doing the lab work because their DNA keeps getting into their own samples. And no matter how good their technique is, and it might just be that those particular individuals give off more skin cells than others. We all give off skin cells. It's just the rates are going to be different from one person to another, and we have no idea why.
So another scientific factor that has to be taken into consideration, you would agree, is how some individuals shed more often.
And typically, we're not going to know who the shedders are within this room and who the shedders aren't, or really if there's that big a difference from the.
And that's weird, the saying shedder. Can't you guys think of some other way to?
I didn't come up with that stuff.
Well, another factor too is the manner of the handling. I think we talked about that as well. How contact is made with an object. You really kind of have to know that too to know whether transfer took place, right?
And that's the friction and the duration and what kind of material is being transferred.
Even the part of a hand is different. The fingertips are different than the palm, different than the back, right?
I would assume if you're very calloused there, you're not going to have as much transfer.
And when we talk about clothing, inner collar and wrist areas of a garment can include more DNA from the individual who's wearing it. And if you did find DNA in other parts of clothing, it'd be more likely to find the other individuals away from those areas, right?
Analysts have found that, and the collar areas, as you're saying, the wrist, the armpits on shirts, for example, are very good for transfer. And then other places that seem a little bit odd for your DNA to come off from wearing, that may be a transfer from somebody who came into contact with you, somebody who punched you or somebody who hugged you. There's no way of knowing.
So, I mean, they kind of wrap this up here and say that when you talk about the means of the use of handling items that are relevant, you have to have knowledge of the history of the item of interest, the contacts with the item relevant to the activity, the difference in transfer rates by parts of the hand. And these are all things that, in order to come to any kind of scientific opinion, you need to know, right?
I think it's challenging to understand if you don't know, for example, the history, and usually we don't. We don't know the history of how DNA came to be on an item. DNA typing, as elegant and sensitive as it is, can never tell us how the DNA got there or when it got there. The clues that we do have in some instances are body fluid tests. That can tell you a little bit about the how.
So if you don't have some of these factors present, you can't examine them, then you're just kind of in the realm of possibilities like you talked about, right?
Yeah, you have to discuss all the possible scenarios in order to do a proper interpretation of what might have been.
So let's kind of work with the theory here to discuss circumstances where you'd expect individuals' DNA to be, other individuals' DNA to be found on another person. And in this case, we'll just use a hypothetical, a young girl who's murdered. Okay, so that night the young girl was murdered, let's say that young girl came into contact with numerous individuals that night. Individuals who talked to her, spent time with her, maybe gave her a hug, maybe gave her a handshake, sat down in the same area with her, could have gotten in and out of her car at some point in time. You'd expect to see those individuals, well, it's possible, I guess, at least you'd see their DNA.
There's
On
always
that-
possibility. It depends on where you check for the DNA,
Right.
too,
But
as
those-
well.
Those factors, though, that increases the likelihood of the individual's DNA being found on our young girl in that scenario, right?
Yeah, it does depend on whether there was some kind of contact or some kind of vicinity of the two people being with each other, and whether they faced each other and talked was going to have an impact on that as well.
Like you said with the microphone here, which kind of leads me to leave, I need to clean it or something, but when you talk, yeah, your DNA, when you're close to somebody, that increases that likelihood, right? That
Exactly.
your DNA might end up with them. So you got a young girl in a situation where she's, talking to 15, 20 people in close vicinity with them, sitting down with them, maybe even sharing food or beverage with them. You got a real good chance of finding potentially the DNA on her at a later date, right, or in her vicinity.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say a real good chance. I'd just say that if you access the right areas, yes, there's a chance that you find somebody else's DNA there.
That's beyond just the realm of possibilities, though. That's a little bit more possible, isn't it?
The more contact, the more closeness between two people, yes, there's a higher and higher possibility that there would be some kind of transfer event of some
And so-
mechanism.
So let's take another scenario here. And that scenario is that you have an individual who comes in more direct physical contact with her. Okay, so they're actually in the same car together, and let's say this individual is on top of her holding her down. You have a pretty good chance of having his DNA on her, right?
On various parts, I would be shocked if their DNA wasn't, at least in some places, yes.
And there's a struggle between this individual and her. You got a really good chance there. You got DNA flying everywhere, right?
And if you're talking about on the clothing items, the outer clothing items, it would be, as I said, shocking if you could check everywhere and they're nowhere on there. That would have to be a non-shedder.
Yeah, right, for that to happen. Let's say during the same scenario, that the struggle turns into something more violent and a weapon is used where there's cuts to both individuals. I mean, that's a real good chance of having DNA there for that person, right?
Yes, for both. If there's cuts to both individuals, yes.
And especially if this is something where there's not one cut, but there's cuts over and over again that take place. You got a real good chance of having that person's DNA there, right?
The person who is the victim of all those cuts, their DNA is going to be in large amounts everywhere.
So you're not talking realm of possibilities. You're talking, this is pretty darn well a fact at that point.
If you want to talk about an absolute certainty, yes.
Switching gears just a little bit here, you talked about crime scene, I think, a little bit, handling of evidence like that, but just so we kind of know the circumstances of your background, when you worked for the Indiana State Police Lab, you didn't work on crime scenes, right?
I never visited a single crime scene. I oversaw the collection of material from a vehicle, once with the Indiana State Police and once as a consultant, but that's about as close as I got to a crime scene.
Okay. And so you had some testimony here earlier this morning that you believed, based on your experience, that it was improper to not separate items of evidence.
That's correct.
And in this case, you're probably aware that the items that were contained in the same package were all from Michelle, from the same person, right?
Yes.
Okay. And so your concern, what you're talking about, is you believe it's important to prevent contamination from any foreign sources, like from any foreign source of DNA that wouldn't have been on those clothes to begin with, that somehow ended up on it.
Well,
Is that fair?
in part foreign, if you're talking from outside of the package and into the package, that's always going to be a concern.
Always, yeah.
We're talking more about transfer from item to item.
Item to item, okay. So you're not talking about having a concern about something that wasn't there originally that ended up there, but the transfer from item to item, that's what you're saying might be an
More
issue.
so with the commentary, the bundling things together. That's more about the transfer within the package between different items or different parts of the same item. that can happen. You can't avoid that. If we're talking about, let's just say the dress was packaged by itself, you can have transfer from one part of the dress to the other. And it's just impossible for people who are doing the handling to completely prevent that.
Also, maybe, I didn't see it on your CV, but I'm sure you dealt like with gunshot powder residue and stuff like that, or?
There were cases that involved that, but I have no expertise in that. If there was any kind of issue where maybe something needed to be tested for that, then there were people within my building who did that.
So, well, I guess for example, you wouldn't want gunshot powder examination to be done with items that have been mixed together, because then you couldn't find out where the gunshot was originally.
Well, I don't have the expertise in the gunshot powder residue, but my understanding is it's similar to DNA in that you need to be careful about mixing items.
You mentioned during your testimony cases where, or something along the lines of there being over half the items in crime labs are have DNA from transfer events. Remember saying that?
Yeah, that they're at least, to maybe word that better, that more than half the items in crime labs that were discussed in that review article, more than half those items were designated as items presumed to be where they're looking for some type of handling or transfer event, as opposed to a body fluid.
Okay. And when you say that, we talk about transfer event, that's primary or secondary?
Yes, any kind of primary, secondary, just not involving a body fluid.
Okay. For there to be any kind of secondary transfer, there has to be a primary transfer first, right?
Yes.
We looked at 9C1, I believe, State's Exhibit during your testimony. If we could just get that up really quick here. Yeah, that's okay right there. So, may I approach, Your Honor?
You may.
So if I've learned anything from this case, analysts have really bad handwriting. Do you?
I think mine's better.
Oh, okay. All right, we may test you on that, but if I could just, excuse me here a second. During the testimony here, you mentioned, or Mr. Spees did, that this said repack on 12/31/94, but we also had an exhibit that said 12/31/96. Now, it's not the best handwriting, but you don't know for sure whether that's a 4 or 6, do you?
Well, now that you mention that, because in the timeline, I believe 96 was the year, so it might just be a handwriting issue. And I want to just make sure, I can't see the date on this one. I can't remember if this was which date's at the top. It's kind of blocked off there.
The 2003 one.
Oh, it's right there.
Yeah.
Did you just move that?
We did, yeah.
Okay. I look back, okay. Yeah, that was August 9th, okay. It was the
So obviously
middle
that-
study. Okay.
Is that upset you? Sorry, Mary.
Worry myself.
All right. And you talked a little bit about Linda Sauer's examination here in 2003. And if I heard you right, you said that you think that she did a really thorough examination, right?
Yes.
Didn't have any quarrel with the way she did that?
No.
Okay. And in 2005, the other report that you looked at, you were talking to Mr. Spees about how Linda ran a presumptive test on the evidence there in 2005, but you didn't see it in her notes. You remember that?
That's correct.
But then I think we pointed out that she mentioned it in her reports, right?
Yeah, and just to clarify, she mentions in her notes presumptive tests, but it's difficult to discern whether she's referring to the previous ones from the previous report, or she's saying that the items inventoried down below that were actually presumptively tested. When you look at the report, though, she actually gives the results.
Okay. So you have no reason to believe she didn't do presumptive tests in 2005, right?
No, I don't believe I do now.
And there was some testimony here about how there wasn't a marking done in the area of F5 to indicate where her cutting was taken. Remember that?
Yes,
Okay. And we have the dress here. Have you seen it, or?
yes.
Okay, all right. Can I just get it out really quickly to demonstrate something?
You may.
And I want to touch it, and I don't want to have to put on a glove for now, but see this area down here that's marked?
Yes, I see a marking.
Yeah, and is that in, if we could, now, I guess I'm
When I say I see a marking, I'm talking about just a tape marker.
So down here, you see that area down there?
Yes.
Okay, and clearly there's a cut in the middle, and there's 4 around it. You see that?
I can't see it right now, but I've seen the photos of sort of the 5 cuttings, like on a die, is the way I describe them. If you roll a 5 on the dice, it's in that kind of pattern.
So there's no, I mean, you don't have any problem detecting in the picture, or if you were to look at this, where F5 was, right?
No, I can see at least where that area where the cuttings are.
And then there was some testimony about DNA International doing some additional cuttings. You probably saw that in the materials too, right?
Yes.
Okay. And is it your understanding then that DNA Labs International did those cuttings after a flood took place in Cedar Rapids?
That's my understanding, is it was beyond the flood date, which was in, I believe, '08.
Yeah. And you may not have seen this part of the testimony, or, and obviously you don't have a lot of knowledge about the flood, but isn't it true that, obviously if a dress gets wet from a flood, that's a problem, right?
Yes,
DNA?
I've often testified that water is the arch enemy of DNA. For one thing, it can remove DNA. It may not when it comes into contact with DNA on a fabric, but there's a chance that it will wash it away, and there can also be some degradation caused by the moisture.
And wouldn't you agree that humidity can also be an enemy of DNA, or?
Yes, that's why you don't package items in plastic. You want to keep them in breathable paper sacks.
You testified earlier that blood is an extremely rich source of DNA. You stand by that, I take it?
Absolutely.
And with respect to F5, again, on Michelle's dress, as indicated in 2005, you concur with the finding that the major contributor to F5 was the male and not Michelle, right?
Yes.
If we could have, I think, Defense Exhibit T1 here. As that's coming up, you don't need to have a lot of blood to be able to develop a DNA profile from it, right?
You need very little. Almost an amount of blood, modern day, currently today, a speck that you might not even be able to see, like a period on a sentence, that amount of blood, you should be able to get a full type from that.
And with regard to Defense Exhibit T1 here, I think you told us that this amount here, that are indicated, .062 and whatever the other amount is here, that measures the concentration of the DNA, not the amount, right?
Correct.
So is it true then that State's Exhibit, or Defense Exhibit T1 doesn't really tell us anything about the amount of DNA?
No, it tells us a lot about the amount. It tells us the concentration, and lab analysts are typically going to have either a fraction of a drop or maybe a couple of drops of DNA, but usually it's going to be about 40 to 50 microliters. I don't know what the volume is. I don't believe I saw that in any of the documentation, what the exact volume is, but it's going to be in that ballpark. So the 3 nanograms could go a little bit higher, a little bit lower, depending on the volume. It's not a liter. You wouldn't have a liter of DNA liquid that you'd be working with. That would, and it's not going to be a single microliter. You can barely see that.
In T1, is that meant to indicate the concentration from the area that they were able to develop the DNA?
Yes, and I should say it's an estimate of the concentration. I mentioned that our techniques are so much better now, and even today, the real-time PCR that's used can be, especially in the low levels, wildly inaccurate at times. These slot blots could be inaccurate as well.
But, so we're talking about the area where the DNA was able to be isolated and developed, but this doesn't tell us how much blood was there.
Oh, no, we're not dealing with blood determination here at all. This is just measuring how much DNA is not only in that sample, but the other samples in the list there.
You testified a little bit about whether you thought that this indicated blood from a cut, something like that. I'm not exactly sure what you said, but I guess I just want to be clear here. And you know, you don't have a medical background, right?
Medical related, but I was not a pre-med or anything like that as an undergraduate, no.
And you haven't been qualified to testify in terms of injuries or how injuries bleed?
Not at all, not at all.
Okay, all right. So you really can't tell how much blood may result from a cut, no matter how small or large?
That's only intuitive. My own experiences with cutting myself and skinning my knee, that kind of thing, cutting myself, shaving, that's where the experience begins and ends, and I have no expertise in that area, though.
Some cuts might be big, some cuts might be small, like a nick or a prick or something like that.
They might be shallow, they might be deep, and you're going to bleed more with deeper, bigger cuts. I think everybody knows that.
And maybe this comes from your common experience too, but if you were, well, I'm going to say this probably doesn't come from your common experience, but let's just bear with me here. If you're wearing a glove and you cut yourself on the inside of the glove, you know, from the outside, just barely get a cut in there, but you cut yourself. I mean, doesn't it make sense that a lot of the blood would pool inside of the glove or instead of being dripped out?
I think that's very intuitive. I would expect that as well.
And obviously, you know, if we end up having a hangnail or something like that and we pull on it and realize it right away, we may be able to cover it and prevent blood from continuing to ooze, drip, spurt, whatever. I mean, just our own methods can prevent that blood from gushing out more, right? Common experience.
That's common experience, yes.
In your testimony, you talked about how since 2005, there were no other efforts to determine a male source. But we also talked about the fact that in 2008, there was a flood that took place. So you did see, and you have testified here, that there was testing done on multiple items of clothing through 1997, 2002, and 2003 before 2005, right?
That is correct.
And this item was item F. So you may or may not have seen State's Exhibit 17H. Can I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
This may be somewhat foreign to you because it's not your lab, but there's an indication on this chain of custody form that items A, B, C, D, and E were all sent to off to the laboratory for testing before F.
Yeah, I can't recall which items those are.
Now, as you know, we're not just dealing with a DNA profile of Mr. Burns on a dress. We also have had testimony and evidence of his profile from scrapings on a gear shift selector. You're aware of that, right?
Yeah, I don't think I'd characterize it as his profile. I'd say that it's a profile that is similarities to what was found on the dress.
Fair enough.
It's a partial profile. It was very weak, but what was there was consistent with Mr. You couldn't exclude him, and I agree with that.
Mhm. And you testified something earlier I caught that I just wanted to follow up on. You said that YSTR testing was not an issue in this case?
Yeah, and I misspoke on that. That's
Okay.
true. Now that I've thought about it, there was some YSTR testing that was done on an outsource at a later time, but on the same area.
Mhm. And you had a chance to review those findings, I take it?
Yes, I did.
Well, do you remember, ask you, test your memory about another one of your cases that you worked on. This is 2013, so about 7 years ago. United States District Court, Eastern District of Arkansas, Little Rock Division. This is Kevin Jones versus Mark Frost, Gary Dunn, and James Bacon. That ring a bell?
Yes.
Good memory. All right. In that case, you filed an affidavit with the court where you did some calculations.
Yes.
Remember that? And so you said that based upon the Scientific Working Group on DNA Analysis, SWGDAM, guidelines for statistical interpretation of YSTR data, that you could use the product rule to combine probabilities to discover how many males would be excluded as potential contributors to a DNA profile at two different locations. Does that sound right?
I think I understand what you're saying, and I know what the issue is. Yeah, you can use the product rule as I understood it back then, and I think that, I don't know if that's changed. If you have some low-level STR typing, and you have YSTR typing, which is not anywhere near as good on identifying an individual. You can't identify a male specifically with YSTR typing, but
Well,
you can.
hang on, because you can identify the
Can we let
paternal.
the witness answer, please?
Okay.
I'm sorry, it wasn't responsive, so I was trying to, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just trying to explain that you can identify consistencies with a paternal line, and that can give you a number, and typically those numbers are not as strong as STR, but as I understood it back then, and I don't think anything's changed, you can use the product rule on the determination from YSTR typing and STR typing combined. You can multiply them by each other, and I did in that instance. That was actually a civil case.
Yeah.
The criminal case was over, so it was a civil case related to a criminal prosecution.
So by doing that, in that case, you could take the statistical frequency data that you had of these two different locations, multiply them together, and then find out how many people could be excluded as contributors to both.
Yeah, you could generate an estimate of that. Yes, you can.
So in this case, you've seen the numbers, right?
Yes, I have.
Okay. And I don't want to ask you about necessarily your opinion on those numbers at this time, but using this product rule, you could take 1 in 1,773, which is a number from the YSTR profile, and combine it with the 1 in 100 billion number and get the number of randomly chosen males who were tested that could be, that could be excluded.
Yeah, as I understand how you would do that kind of product rule from two different platforms of testing, that would be acceptable. I think a forensic mathematician could correct me on that if I'm incorrect, but I believe that I researched that properly, and you can.
Can you do that right now?
Can I do that? Well, I don't know if I need to. You can multiply that 700 some odd number. It's not going to have that much of an impact on the number that's already big in the billion range. That you're talking about from the gear shift.
Correct. 1,100, or it's 1,773, I think was.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry, I thought it was 700. Okay, 1,007. You can multiply those two together, and if you want me to get out a calculator, I happen to have my cell phone right here to do that. I could do that for you.
Go ahead.
Could you give me those numbers?
Yeah, sure.
$1,773,
73,
and the other number is
100 billion. maybe you can't do that on your calculator.
It's easier, it's easy enough to just do it and multiply it by 100. And now you got 177,300 billion. So it's a huge number. This is an estimate of, as far as number of random people you'd have to look at to find that profile, especially considering that you do have YSTR data and you do have some very weak STR data, but the defendant can't be excluded from that area.
On your CV, do you have it? You know, I'm not seeing it on here, but I thought I saw it on another one I got a hold of, but this is an article called If DNA, Then Guilty, Strategies for Overcoming Juror Assumptions About DNA Evidence in Criminal Trials. That's an article you contributed to, right?
Yes, it is.
The January/February 2015 issue of The Champion. That's what it was published in, right?
That's correct.
And The Champion is a publication from the National Criminal Defense Attorneys Association.
That's correct.
Do you remember in that article that you contributed to, that it's stated, oh, sorry, again, it is in here. I apologize. You put that in there. Sorry about that. I just couldn't find it. You stated in that article that one of the suggestions that you have for kind of dealing with DNA evidence is to treat it like any other evidence, pull it from the realm of science and demystify it as much as possible, treat it as a set of facts that could be rationally described in an alternate context. Does that sound like something you wrote?
That might have been the sentence I wrote or my co-author, but I think I remember reading that in there.
And that the defense team should effectively identify and present a plausible explanation for the DNA evidence and then use that to support the alternate hypothesis.
Yes, that's a possibility you can do, is look at not just one alternate, but any of the many alternate explanations for what the evidence is showing us and present that as a possibility to the jury, yes.
And that's pretty much, I mean, what you're doing here with the realm of possibilities of transfer DNA, right?
Yeah, there is a realm of possibilities as to how DNA can get moved from a person to an item or from an item to an item.
And that's, would be following along the lines of the recommendation to try to offer some plausible explanation, is that right?
Yes.
On your CV here, you talk about the number of cases you worked on in the crime lab, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I think we clarified here today that you don't currently work in a crime lab, right?
No, I do not.
Unless you have one in the basement of your house.
No.
You ever thought about that?
I don't have a basement.
Oh, must be a New Mexico thing, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, also, you don't actually even have a current certification to do lab work, right?
No, there's no certifying body for independent forensic DNA consultants.
And so it's been a long time since you've done what I think you've referred to before as the wet work, right?
Yes, it's been 12 years since I've done any hands-on work with DNA or any kind of typing, body fluid identifying, anything like that.
And you've testified in a total of 135 criminal proceedings?
Yes, this would be 136 today.
No, congratulations. And that the first 16 you did for the prosecution, but the rest of them you've done for the defense, right?
That's correct.
And you do also do some presentations at conferences for various defense attorney and public defender groups, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Is that kind of like marketing? Like what I can do for you? Or?
I'd call it, it's CLEs, it's continuing education for them, and to a degree it's marketing. That's, as I mentioned in direct, the only people who've called me so far have been defense lawyers, public defenders, or sometimes private citizens, never prosecutors. But I could educate prosecutors if they asked me to.
Appreciate that.
What'd you say?
I said appreciate that. So most of your work, I mean, it sounds like it's done for criminal defense attorneys, though, obviously, right?
Well, since they're the only ones who call, yes.
And you can correct me if I'm wrong with this, but you're more of a document review guy and less of a hands-on guy, right?
I'd say I'm not at all a hands-on guy. There's no hands-on work involved except for handling the documents.
Nothing further at this time, Your Honor.
Redirect Mr. Spies.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Spence, you were asked about providing plausible explanations. You don't just get on the stand and make stuff up, do you?
Oh, absolutely not.
I mean, the explanations that you've given the men and women of the jury in this case, and you would in any case, is based on the evidence that you understand is present in that case.
In part, the evidence that's in the case, but also the scientific reviews on transfer events, for example, and real cases where there are transfer events.
Could you give us an example of a transfer event that's a real case?
Yes, I can. I know of a case that's in my book chapter that is a California man who was a victim of a homicide. There was a home invasion. The people who came in were masked, and they bound up a couple of victims, but one of the people who was bound up was a man who passed away from suffocation. He was bound up too much. They found on the fingernails of that victim a DNA profile, and they ran it through the CODIS database. This is a database for searching for if that person's out there, and there was. There was a person who pretty much resided downtown in California, in San Jose, who was an alcoholic, homeless, and who was on the CODIS database. He's there on the fingernails of a murder victim, so they charged him with being part of that group that broke in. The defense looked at the case and realized that the night of that break-in, this person had drank too much, like he often did, passed out in a convenience store, and was taken by paramedics into a hospital and was there the whole night. And it was all during the whole time that the home invasion occurred, which was in the home of a millionaire who lived 10 miles away. So they knew there was no, unless there was something wrong with the record keeping, there's no way he could have been there, and they verified all that. And it wasn't until a prosecution's investigator looked more closely at the case and realized that the two paramedics who delivered this homeless man into the hospital were the same two paramedics who 3 hours later were called out to the crime scene to tend to somebody that they had no chance of resuscitating. They handled him, put him on a gurney, and took him out. So they handled the same homicide victim as the person who was accused, but there's no way that person could have been at the crime scene.
And the DNA of the homeless person was found on the hands of the crime victim?
On the fingernails, yes. A full profile that was qualified for CODIS searches and identified him in that way.
So taking into account all of the factors about which you've been questioned that affect the transfer of DNA from one location to another, from one person to another, friction, duration, type of surface, the type of event, whether it's liquid or dry, humid or not, whether the person is a shedder or not, is it, Dr. Spence, a plausible explanation that the DNA of Jerry Burns found on the dress or on the gear shift could have come about by a transfer?
Objection, Your Honor, that is speculation. There's no evidence in the record to suggest that, and no foundation to make that opinion, expert or otherwise.
Any response to the objection?
This is directly related to the questioning during cross-examination.
The witness will be permitted to respond, answer the question, the hypothetical question. And ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you will be instructed that with an expert witness, as with any other witness you've heard from, it's up to you to assess the weight and credibility for any testimony that you hear. But the witness will be permitted to answer the question,
It could
if you can
just-
remember.
Probably not. If you could please give me the question again, Your Honor.
Just 1 second.
If our court reporter could assist, please.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Question, so taking into account all the factors about which you've been questioned that affect the transfer of DNA from one location to another, from one person to another, friction, duration, type of surface, the type of event, whether it's liquid or dry, humid or not, whether the person is a shedder or not, is it, Dr. Spence, a plausible explanation that the DNA of Jerry Burns found on the dress or on the gear shift could have come about by a transfer?
Yes, that's a distinct possibility.
You've told us that you can't always know the sequence of events that precede the snapshot about which you've testified, which is oftentimes all that the forensic scientist has left is that snapshot, right?
That's always what they have, is the snapshot of what's there at the time that they take their cuttings and they look at what's there.
And you've identified for the men and women of the jury and for us the danger of transfer, especially when items are bundled up. An item can be transferred within an item, between items. It's always a risk, isn't it?
That's a distinct possibility as well.
Even though you were not a crime scene technician, nonetheless, did you have to be informed about and most of all professionally sensitive to what happens at a crime scene to know about how well an item was retrieved, cataloged, preserved, handled?
Yes, very much so. The communication there is extremely important, and I was looking at the items that they did collect from the crime scene. That's typically what I was going to be doing, is looking at the more movable items that you can handle on a bench top.
And finally, Dr. Spence, the questions you were asked about the .062 concentration that Linda Sauer found in 2005 on item F5, you said that it tells you a lot about the amount of DNA that she was able to isolate and test. Am I right?
Yes, I did.
And were you able to deduce from that amount of DNA the likelihood of the male profile coming from blood versus some other biological source?
Well, I'd say it's less likely, only because it would have to be such an incredibly tiny amount of blood that was drawn up into that extraction off that cutting. As I stated, I think earlier, it would come down to about 1/800th of a single drop of blood.
And of the many articles about which you were questioned this morning, Dr. Spence, do any of those articles, the research that you're familiar with, shake the confidence with which you testified today?
Not at all.
Thank you.
Additional cross-examination, Mr. Maybanks.
Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Spence, when you were asked the question by Mr. Spies whether an explanation was plausible, you said it was a distinct possibility, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Which means it's in the realm of possibilities we talk about when we talk about transfer of DNA, right?
Yes.
But you're not opining, again, in this case, that you believe that a transfer of DNA from Jerry Burns to Michelle Martinko took place in some sort of secondary, tertiary fashion.
I don't believe that the transfer did happen, or I don't believe that the transfer didn't happen. It's impossible to tell from that snapshot and all the information we've talked about here in the last couple of hours.
And that was a really fascinating and interesting story that you told about what happened in California. It's a good thing that the steps were retraced in that case. In this case, would you agree that based upon your analysis of the case that you didn't find any evidence whatsoever putting Jerry Burns in a position to transfer DNA other than speculating or creating events that took place.
Yeah, well, I refuse to speculate up here, and it would be incredibly difficult to do so, especially with a 40-year-old crime.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Additional examination for Dr. Spence.
No, Doctor, I think you answered the question. It's extraordinarily difficult to reconstruct what happened 40 years ago, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything further, Mr. Maybanks?
None necessary, Your Honor.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Dr. Spence. You may step down.
Thank you.
Defendant may call his next witness.
Your Honor, we have a matter we'd like to take up with the court
Okay,
outside the presence of the jury.
okay, very good. Ladies and gentlemen, we will adjourn for lunch, and we'll have you come back at 1:30.